Oh, I guess it doesn't tell you, doesn't give you the recording notification twice. That's okay. We'll cut this out in post or whatever. I learned there's a laser pointer, so I think someone in feedback noted that it was hard to see the pointer. So now there's a laser pointer and I can do this and make all your eyes bleed. Someone asked about homework too. It should be out like today, right? Okay. Hi everyone, welcome back to CS 161 Lecture 5, Dan Garcia. Woo! I spent 3 hours practicing that and it still didn't come out too well. So this is Introduction to Cryptography. So the memory safety unit is over. If you were not a fan of C and GDB, there's no more lectures on that. So congrats. If you are not a fan of CS70, I'm really sorry because now we have a couple of lectures with a lot of math inside. Okay, before we get started, there are a couple of announcements. So homework 1 is still out. It's due Tuesday, which is today if you're watching live lecture. If you're watching this on a tape delay, Tuesday may have been a couple of days ago, but yeah. And project 1 is released on the website and it's due Tuesday, July 6th. So if you're watching the live lecture, that's a week from today. If you've watched up to this lecture, you have everything you need for the project. So all you need is memory safety, and we already finished covering that, so you're good to go. And just as a warning, debugging project 1 can be very time consuming. If anyone's started, you can attest to the fact that if you don't have the exact exploit and you have to debug it, sometimes it takes a bit of time. So if you haven't started already, I would highly recommend getting started. Okay, I think those are the only announcements. I guess one other not too important thing is maybe Nicholas, I don't know, but I got a couple of emails addressing me as professor. Both of us are actually like undergraduate or graduate instructors in the fall and spring, so you don't have to call us professor or Mr. or sensei or anything. Just Payron and Nicholas is fine. Okay, so like I said, last time we talked a bit about memory safety mitigations. So there are all these exploits that work on non-memory safe languages. So how do we defend against them? And we talked about how the one way to stop all of them is to use a memory safe language like Python or Java. And the reason why we do that, or the reason why we don't always use memory safe languages is because of, well, some people say it's because of performance, but we think it's mostly because of legacy and existing code. You can also write memory safe code in non-memory safe languages, but it takes a lot of discipline and sometimes it's very tedious. You can also use tools to help you build secure software and patch insecure code, but that requires sometimes a lot of security patches. So that also sometimes doesn't, it's not foolproof, right? And then we talked a lot about mitigations. So there were non-executable pages, there were stack canaries. In the interest of time, I'm just gonna quickly skip over these. So non-executable pages says you make your memory either executable or writable, but not both. And that means the attacker can't write shellcode to memory and execute it at the same time. But there are ways around that, right? You can use return to libc and execute stuff that already exists in the C library, or you can turn it up to 11 and use return-oriented programming and chain together lots of little gadgets to create your own code. You can also use stack canaries to mitigate memory safety vulnerabilities. So you add a sacrificial value on the stack. It's just a random value that's never used, which means if the value is changed, that's a pretty good sign that someone's messing with our system. And that would defeat an attacker overwriting the RIP because they would knock out the stack canary. There are ways to get around this though. You can write around the canary, you can leak the canary, or you can brute force the canary. Okay, and then pointer auth is kind of a fancier version of stack canaries, where you take unused bits in the address and replace them with a pointer authentication code. And before you're going to use that address, you check that the pointer authentication code is still valid. And finally, there's address space layout randomization, or ASLR. And how that works is you take each segment of memory, you put it in a different location every single time, so the attacker doesn't know the addresses. And to get around that, you can leak an address or brute force it. And combining these is really great. Sometimes if you combine them, they become greater than the sum of their parts. And usually the attacker would have to find multiple vulnerabilities. Okay, so that's my speed run of what happened last time. So that was memory safety. If you remember way back in the first lecture, there are 4 big sections of this class. So we're done with the first one. Now today is the second one. which is cryptography. So to get started, we're going to talk about what is cryptography, and then we're going to talk a lot about definitions. So kind of describe the problem we're trying to solve and how we should solve it. And then we'll give you a brief history just for fun. And then some definitions of in-CPA security, which is a security property we'll talk about. And then 110 pads, which is our very first cryptographic scheme. So that's the outline. Okay, so to get started, we have to talk about what is cryptography. And cryptography, in short, is the study of secure communication over insecure channels. So for example, if I wanted to send something to Nicholas, or Nicholas wanted to send something to me, and there were attackers trying to spy on our communication or tamper with our communication, cryptography is the study of how we can talk securely, even though there are attackers trying to mess with us. Sometimes you see it abbreviated crypto. So if we ever say crypto, we mean cryptography, not cryptocurrency or anything. So again, the goal of cryptography is to keep our information secure in the presence of attackers that are trying to make our information not secure. And modern cryptography involves a lot of math. So this section, the coming week or two, is going to be definitely the most mathy part of this class. So if you don't like math, you're going to have to bear with us, but we'll try to make it as bearable as possible. And again, there are some things from CS70, which is our discrete math class, that might come up, but if they do, we'll definitely review them for you before we talk about them. Okay, before we start, I have to give you this disclaimer. We do this every semester. It's kind of important. So most of the things we teach you in this class, it's okay to try them on your own systems or even try them on other people's systems if they give you permission. But for this section only, we have to tell you, you cannot try this at home. So the reason why is because we're going to teach you a lot of basic building blocks of cryptography, so you'll kind of know how things work and how the problems have been solved. But we're not going to give you the full picture of cryptography. So we're going to give you enough to know what's going on, but not enough to write your own cryptography. So you should never take the things you've learned from this class and try to write your own cryptographic algorithms. And the reason why is because cryptography is very fragile. If you mess up with just one tiny little bug, it's possible that the entire algorithm just no longer works. So you could have an algorithm that's totally secure in theory, but when you're implementing it, if you implement it just slightly wrong, the entire thing breaks. And we'll see tons of examples of that over the next couple of weeks. So it's very easy to screw up. There are so many little edge cases in crypto, and a lot of them are really tedious and really hard to notice. So we're not going to show you all the edge cases, and that means that you should never try to write your own crypto under any circumstances. So instead of writing your own crypto, what you should do is you should take other people's crypto that were written by very smart experts, and they've been checked by people over the years, and use their libraries that exist instead of trying to write your own crypto. I have to include this because Nick Weaver, who's a frequent 161 instructor, likes to quote a Twitter account called Swift on Security. And the quote is, "Cryptography is nightmare magic math that cares about what kind of pen you use." So just by using the wrong pen, it's possible that everything goes wrong. Okay, just to really hammer it home, we have an example of why you shouldn't try crypto at home. And this one comes to us from about a year ago. Things went online, and CS61A, which is a really big intro to programming class, wrote a program to distribute online exams. So they had to send exams to people, and then when the exam started, they could open it and start working. Now, the problem is they had to write some cryptography to keep their exams secure. But when they were doing so, they took an algorithm that's secure in theory, but they implemented it in a way that was not totally secure. And that basically just destroyed any security. So if you took 61A in summer of 2020, it actually was possible to open the exam before it was released. Oops. And it turns out the attack to do so actually isn't that bad. And later in the semester, you actually will be able to do the exact attack that on their system. So we'll give you the system that the 61A students got, and we'll give you some guidance that you will be able to break their exam system. So if any 161 student was taking 61A in summer of 2020, they could have seen the exam ahead of time. So not good. And We did find out this happened after the fact, but we actually never found out if anyone actually successfully attacked it. So yeah, did they accidentally make our project? Pretty much. So when we saw this, Nick and some of the other 161 TAs just realized, hey, they just wrote a project for us. So yeah, that's true. Do they use this code for other classes? I think this code, as soon as it was caught, was like retired and never used again. So in fall and onwards, they used code that used secure libraries instead of the insecure version that was written. So anyway, they did report that the exam may have been leaked. So some people claimed it, but we actually never found out if anyone decrypted it. So it will forever be a mystery whether their mistake was bad or really bad or really, really bad. So we'll never know. And the TAs who wrote this had taken this class. They had heard us yell at them about not trying it at home, and they tried it at home anyway. So now they will live on in infamy as a blue slide at the very beginning of every crypto lecture every semester. So thank you, unnamed TAs. Okay. So again, we say this a lot. We'll say it again and again. Do not roll your own crypto. Use existing libraries. Do not try this stuff at home. Okay. Oops, that was fast. So that's our intro to crypto. We told you what crypto is and not to try it at home. Now we can talk about definitions. So we kind of have to talk about what is the problem we're trying to solve in crypto. We have to define that. How should we solve it? How do we know that we have a good solution? How do we measure the security of our schemes? So that's all stuff we have to define before we can get started. So the first thing we're going to do is meet Alice, Bob, Eve, and Mallory. So these are cast of characters for crypto. So Alice and Bob are our heroes. And what they're going to try to do for the next 2 weeks is send messages to each other over an insecure communication channel. So Alice and Bob want to send secret messages, and they want to do so in the presence of an attacker. So those are our heroes. And then our villains are Eve. So Eve is an eavesdropper who can read any data that's sent over the insecure channel. And Mallory is a manipulator who can read and modify any data sent over the channel. So these are our two attackers, and Alice and Bob are our two heroes. And you see this a lot in crypto literature. So even in academic papers, they often talk about Alice, Bob, Eve, and Mallory. So that's why we use these characters. And a lot of problems that we're going to try to solve will be defined in terms of Alice, Bob, Eve, and Mallory based on their stated goals. So for example, Alice wants to send a message to Bob, but Eve is going to eavesdrop and listen in on the communication channel. So the problem is, how is Alice going to get the message to Bob without letting Eve learn about the message? So that's one thing we're going to try to solve. Another thing we might have to solve is Bob wants to send a message to Alice, but Mallory now is going to tamper with the communication channel. She's going to modify the data that's sent over the channel. So how is Bob going to get the message to Alice without Mallory changing it? So that's another problem we're going to try to solve. So those are our cast of characters. Now we are going to talk quickly about the goals of cryptography. So there are 3 main security properties that we want on our data. So the first one is confidentiality. And what this says is an adversary can't read our messages. So if Alice and Bob are communicating, even Mallory shouldn't be able to learn what the messages are. Then there's integrity. And this says an adversary can't change our messages without being detected. So if Mallory tries to screw up the message, Alice and Bob should be able to detect that and realize, hey, wait a minute, something is wrong here. And authenticity says that when I receive a message, I can check and prove that this message came from the person who claims to have written it. So if I get a message and it says, this is from Alice, I have a cryptographic mathematical way to prove that this message really came from Alice and not somebody else. And if you kind of squint, integrity and authenticity are pretty closely related, right? Because if I want to prove that this message came from Alice, I also have to prove that the message hasn't been changed. So they're kind of closely related, but there are some cases where they're not identical. So we'll talk about those as they come up. But there are 3 main properties: it's confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. Okay, I've talked for quite a bit. So does anyone have questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. And again, we'll see some edge cases. Okay, so the fundamental building block of any cryptographic scheme is a key. And the key is what we're going to use to secure our messages. So there are two models of keys that you might encounter in cryptography. There's the symmetric key model. So in this model, Alice and Bob both know the value of a secret key, and nobody else knows the value of the secret key. So that's symmetric key. Then there's one called asymmetric key, which is everybody has a pair of keys. So everyone has a secret key, and they have a matching public key. And you can use those to perform cryptography as well. And we'll talk about both of these in a lot of detail. And if you remember way back to the CS70, you may have heard about something called RSA, and that was a public key scheme or an asymmetric key scheme. But we'll talk about both of these in more detail. Okay, so when we're talking about cryptography, there's a security principle that comes in play. It's called Kirchhoff's principle, and it's really closely related to Shannon's maxim from the first lecture. So Shannon's maxim from the first lecture was saying, don't use security through obscurity, assume the attacker knows the system. So if you remember the zombies ahead signs, right? The reason why you can go in and change the highway signs is because the password for the highway signs are hidden inside a user manual, and the location of the control box is in the back. But if the attacker knows the system, they can figure out how to change the thing. So that's Shannon's maxim. And Kirchhoff's principle is pretty similar, and what it says is crypto systems should remain secure even when the attacker knows all the internal details of the system. So it's kind of the same thing, but related to cryptographic schemes. So in crypto schemes, the only thing that should be secret is the key. And the system should make it easy to change keys that are leaked or suspected to be leaked. So if someone steals your key, then all you have to do to make your scheme secure again is just change your keys. And the reason why this is a good design is because if the attacker knows your system, and the key is the only secret thing, then if the attacker steals your key, all you have to do is change the key and you're safe again. But if the system design itself is designed to be secret and the attacker learns about your secret design, then what are you going to do? Are you going to change the whole design? Are you going to have to rewrite the program? That would take a lot of work, right? So changing the key is very easy. You just change the value of the secret key. If you were trying to keep your entire design secret and the attacker figured out your design, now you have to swap out your design, which is going to take a lot of work. So for the entire crypto unit, our threat model assumption is going to be the attacker knows all the algorithms we use, and the only information the attacker is missing is the secret key or keys. So that's Kirchhoff's principle. So now we're going to quickly talk about the three properties from before, and we're going to think about the keys and also Kirchhoff's principle when we're talking about them. So remember, confidentiality says an adversary can't read our messages. So if we think really quickly about sending things in the real world, so let's not think about computers for a second. Let's just think about if I wanted to send you a package and I wanted nobody to be able to open the package except you, something I could do is I could lock it, right? So maybe Alice takes her key and locks the message in a box, and then she sends the box over the insecure channel. So if any attacker tries to tamper with the box or try to open the box, they can't because it's locked and they don't have the key. So if she can see the box, but she can't see what's inside because she doesn't have a key. And then Bob's going to receive the message inside the box, and he's going to unlock the message using the key. So he opens the box with the key and then gets the message. So if I was in the real world, this is something I could do to provide confidentiality on my message. And it turns out in computers, it's basically the same thing. So instead of saying we're locking things, we're going to say we're encrypting things. So Alice is going to encrypt the message with the key, and that just says we're going to change the message into a scrambled form. Alice is going to send the encrypted message over the insecure channel. If you're Eve, you see the encrypted message, but you can't figure out what the original message is because you don't have the key. So you can't unlock the message. And then once the encrypted message gets to Bob, Bob's going to decrypt it with the key and change it back to its original form. So it's basically the same thing as locking the message, but we're doing so with math and numbers. So that's confidentiality. as a quick naming note, sometimes instead of saying message and encrypted message, sometimes we say plain text and ciphertext. So plain text is just another word for the original message, and ciphertext is just another word for the encrypted message. So sometimes you see that. Okay. The other property we're looking for is integrity and authenticity, which we've kind of combined because they're pretty similar. And the idea for providing integrity and authenticity is basically the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a seal on the message. So for example, Alice takes her key and adds a special seal on the message. So you can think of this as maybe she has some secret form of tape or some tape that only Alice owns, and she puts tape on the envelope. So she puts the letter in the envelope and then puts some tape on it. Then Alice sends the message and the seal over the insecure channel. So the message inside the envelope with the tape on it. Now, if Mallory wants to tamper with the message, so if she wants to open the envelope and change what's inside, what's going to happen? Well, if I open the envelope, the seal is going to break. Right? The tape's going to have to break. And if you don't have the key, you can't create the tape yourself. Or that's the assumption we're going to make. And then once Bob receives the message, he will take the seal and check that the seal has not been broken. And if it hasn't been broken, then Mallory hasn't messed with it. But if the tape is all messed up, then Bob thinks that the message has probably been messed with. So that's generally how you provide integrity. The computer way is basically the same. You use the key to generate a tag or a signature. You send the message and the tag over the insecure channel. If someone tampers with the message, the tag will no longer be valid. So it's like breaking the seal. And then when Bob receives the message, he'll check the tag and check that the tag is still valid. So we're going to talk a lot about integrity in a future lecture, so we'll table that for now. But just so you know, this is generally how it's done. Okay, the last definition, so we've thrown a lot of information at you, but the last definition you have to know is a threat model. So we have mentioned that Eve can eavesdrop and Mallory can read messages, but what if they can do more than that? It's not clear, right? We haven't defined what our threat model is. So what other things can Eve do? What other things can Mallory do? And it turns out a lot of real world schemes are vulnerable to attackers who can do more than just eavesdrop or tamper. So as cryptographers, we have to create more sophisticated threat models to model what people in the real world are doing. And there are a whole bunch of different threat models. For now, we'll just think about a couple for just confidentiality. And a couple of these include ciphertext only, chosen plaintext, chosen ciphertext, and chosen plaintext ciphertext. Now, you don't have to worry about these too much. The general idea is that there are two different attacks that we're going to deal with. One of them says Eve can trick Alice into encrypting messages of Eve's choosing. So Eve will tell Alice, encrypt this, and Alice will just do it for her. And Eve could also trick Bob into decrypting messages of her choosing. So Eve will tell Bob, here's something, decrypt it, and Bob will just decrypt it for her. So those are two different things that might happen in the real world, and we have to model those. So depending on what the attacker can do, we have different models. So there are 4 different ones here. The one we're going to focus on is chosen plaintext. So we will assume that Eve can trick Alice into encrypting stuff, but she can't trick Bob into decrypting stuff. And in practice, cryptographers often use the chosen plaintext ciphertext one, where they defend against both attacks. And the reason why they like that one is because it's the most powerful one. So if we defend against the most powerful threat model, then we have a really secure system. And also it turns out that a lot of modern schemes can be defended against with the chosen plaintext ciphertext model. But for this class, just worry about the chosen plaintext model. Okay, I think we reached the end of definitions. I know that was a lot, and we're going to slow down and talk about all that stuff in detail really shortly. So in the meantime, does anyone have questions? If there are no questions, we'll give you a really brief history of cryptography. Most of this is just for fun, so we're not going to test you on the history, but we're going to use the history to talk a lot about the definitions that we just mentioned. So it might be worth sticking around for this. So we're going to take you in a time machine and go way back to like 2,000 years ago. We're going to talk about probably the first cipher any humans came up with. And this one's called the Caesar cipher, named after Julius Caesar, or maybe Caesar salad, but probably Julius Caesar. And the way this works is first we're going to choose a key, and the key is going to be a number between 0 and 25. So we could say the key is 5, or the key is 10, or the key is 20. And the way we're going to encrypt a message is we're going to take every letter in the message and we're going to shift it forward by k positions in the alphabet, and that's our ciphertext. So for example, let's try to encrypt the message dog, D-O-G, with the key k equals 3. So we're going to take the first letter of dog, D, and we're going to push it forward by 3 positions. So if you remember your alphabet, it goes D, E, F, G. So the first ciphertext letter is G. Then we take the letter O, and we shift it forward by 3, and we get P, Q, R. So R is the second letter. Then we take G, and we go H, I, J, and we get J. So the ciphertext is G, R, J. So that's the encryption of the plaintext dog. So we scrambled it up, and when we send G, R, J over the channel, the attacker probably won't know that it says dog. Now, how do I decrypt something? So decryption is I have to unscramble what I just scrambled. So I want to go backwards, right? So I take the letters in my ciphertext C, and I replace them with the letter K positions earlier. So I take G, and now I have to recite the alphabet backwards, which is kind of hard, but I know some people who can do it. So you go G, F, E, D, so I get D. I take R, and I go backwards by 3. I go R, Q, P, O, and I get O. And then I take J, and I go backwards, and I get J, I, H, G. So I get dog back. So that's how I decrypt. And notice that encryption and decryption are kind of opposites of each other, right? So if I encrypt, I go forward, and then when I decrypt, I go backwards. And if I encrypt and then I decrypt again, I get the original message back. So that's the Caesar cipher. Now let's think about attacks on the Caesar cipher. So let's say you're Eve and you see the ciphertext J, C, K, and E, C, G, U, C, T. I don't really know what this says, and Eve doesn't know what this says because we don't have the key K, so we can't run decryption. If we knew the key K, we can just shift it backwards and we're done, but we don't know K. So if you were Eve, how would you try to break this algorithm? Any ideas on how we might attack it? So someone said brute force, the possibility of each letter in English. Yeah, those are all really good ideas, right? So the first thing we're going to try is brute force. So brute force says, how many keys are there? There's like 25, 26. So let's just try every single key. Ta-da! We tried every single key. Okay, so if there are 26 or 25 or 26 different keys, we decrypted the message with all 26 different keys, and these are the results. Does anyone have a guess to what the original message was? Well, two is probably the key, right? So the message is probably this one, right? And why did we think this was the message? Because it's the only one that looks like an English message, right? Or it has real meaning. So the two things we did here to attack were, the first thing we did is we did brute force. We just tried every single key and decrypted every single key with every single key. The other thing we did is we used our existing knowledge. So we took a guess and we were like, this message is probably in English. So when we decrypted, we picked the one message that looks like it's in English. And that's how we decrypted. So we didn't know the key, but we figured it out with a brute force attack and leveraging our existing knowledge. Okay, so that's Caesar cipher. There are also some other things we can do with the Caesar cipher. So again, here's our ciphertext. I don't know the key. So let's try a chosen plaintext attack. Remember, chosen plaintext says I can trick Alice into encrypting whatever I want. So if I'm Eve, I'm going to tell Alice, how about you encrypt AAA for me? And if I do that, I'm going to get back CCC because Eve is going to encrypt with the key, or Alice is going to encrypt with the key and send it back to me. Well, if the message is AAA and the ciphertext is CCC, I can take a look at this and I can realize, well, C is 2 letters after A. So Alice used K equals 2, right? Now Eve has the key, so she can decrypt the ciphertext. Oops, and I guess that's it. So using a chosen plaintext attack, we figured out what the key is, and now we can decrypt the ciphertext. So that's the Caesar cipher. So kind of scrambles the message, but not very securely, right? So scramble the message, but not very securely. Okay, the next thing we can do is a substitution cipher. So this is a little bit fancier. So instead of just shifting letters forward, we're actually going to create a mapping of every character. So in this case, we're going to say, A equals N, B maps to Q, C maps to L. So we're not just shifting forward. we're creating an entire mapping. So the shift is no longer constant. So how do we generate keys here? So the key is no longer just a number. Now the key has to be the entire mapping. So in this case, the key is A equals N, B equals Q, C equals L, D equals Z, and so on. This whole thing on the left or on the right is the key. And how do I encrypt? It's kind of the same as before. I take the key, and for every letter, I map it to the output. So DOG becomes ZPV. That's my encryption. And then decryption, I just go backwards. So if I get ZPV, I work backwards in my key and I get DOG back. And one thing that I might point your attention to is that every letter is mapped to a unique other letter, right? So for example, we don't have A maps to N, and then B maps to N, and then C maps to N. So why don't we have, what would break if I mapped multiple letters in the plaintext to the same ciphertext letter? Would that still work? Or would it not work? Any ideas? I can't decrypt, right? So the reason why I can't decrypt is because if I map A to N, and then I map B to N, and then I map C to N, well, then if I give you the ciphertext N, how are you going to decrypt it? Does it decrypt to A? Does it decrypt to B? Does it decrypt to C? I don't know, right? So one thing you have to watch out for is that, and we'll see this again tomorrow, but encryption algorithms, someone already pointed this out, which is cool. They have to be bijective. So I have to map each input to exactly one output. I can't map two inputs to one output because then I don't know how to go backwards. So we'll see that again tomorrow, but just for preview, and it seems like a lot of people already have an idea, which is very cool. Okay, so what are ways we can attack the substitution cipher? Well, can we still brute force? Well, how many keys are there, right? There are a lot of different keys. There are 26 factorial different keys because there are 26 possibilities here, 25 possibilities here, 24, and so on. So that's not great. There are way too many for modern computers. Someone put it out the letter distribution analysis, which is definitely one that could work. So letter distribution says, well, if I encrypt the same letter 10 times, so if I encrypt D 10 times, I'm going to get Z 10 times, right? If I encrypt the same thing, I always get the same output. So if I get a really long ciphertext, I could look for what letter appears the most often, and I'll realize, well, in the English language, the letter E comes up a lot. So if I see a letter that comes up a lot, that could be the ciphertext for E. Or if I look at my ciphertext and I realize one of the letters only comes up twice, maybe it's X or Q or one of these rare letters. So you can do frequency analysis, and that works on substitution ciphers. But for this class, we're going to think about chosen plaintext again, because that's one of our threat models. So one thing you could trick Alice to encrypting is, I'm going to tell Alice to encrypt A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. So encrypt the entire alphabet. And if I do that and Alice gives me the encryption, what did she just give me? She just gave me the whole key. So for the substitution cipher, brute force no longer works because there are too many keys. But chosen plaintext does work because I can trick Alice into encrypting this. So again, depends on your threat model, right? So some threat models, if chosen plaintext was not in our threat model, then this might be secure. But because chosen plaintext is in our threat model, the substitution cipher is also not secure. Okay, next one. So now we're going to skip way forward. That was 2,000 years ago. Now we're going to skip to 1940s, and we're going to talk about Enigma. So maybe people have heard of this. Enigma was a mechanical encryption machine. So it was an actual machine to do encryption and decryption. It was used by Germans in World War II. So here's an Enigma machine. There's a lot of moving parts, but the two parts I'll point your attention to are the rotors up here. So the rotor is it's like a wheel with gears on it, and it spins. And down here, there's a plug board. So the plug board has a lot of holes in it, and you take your wires and you connect parts of the plug board. So I can take a wire, I can plug one side into the left and then one side into the right, and that creates a plug board mapping. So this is how you set up Enigma. You take the wires, put them in the plug board, you take the rotors, you put them in the machine, and you tick them into the right position. And then to encrypt, you're going to close the lid. So it's a lid that closes. And once you close the lid, what do you see? You see a keyboard, which is down here, and then you see a lamp board up here, and they have all the letters. So what you're going to do is you're going to type a letter on the keyboard, the machine will do its encryption, and the lamp board will light up the corresponding ciphertext. Someone pointed out something in the chat. So And yeah, they pointed out that the offset, you have to set offsets for the rotors. So yeah, once you put the rotors in, you have to tick them around until they're in the right position. So again, here's Enigma. I think we talked about this a little already, but to choose a key, what you do is there are lots of different rotors. You take 3 of them, you put them in a certain order. So maybe today I use rotor A on the left side, rotor L on the middle, and then rotor C on the right side. Then I take the rotors into their starting positions, and then I take the plug board and I connect a bunch of wires until the plug board is all filled up. And it turns out, how many possibilities are there for rotors, rotor positions, and plug board settings? That's a lot of numbers, right? So that's a lot of different keys. And the Germans thought this was a huge number and probably couldn't be brute forced. So how do you encrypt and decrypt? We also talked about this. You input the rotor settings, so you set the key up, and then once you press a letter, the lamper will output the ciphertext letter. And the same thing works for ciphertext. So if I have ciphertext, if I type the letter, then the rotor will light up the plaintext letter. And encryption and decryption are the same algorithm. And the Germans thought this was completely unbreakable. So they thought there was no way anyone could break this. We designed this to be totally secure. There's no way in the course of the world that anyone's going to be able to decrypt messages with Enigma without the key. So how did Enigma get broken? I guess spoiler alert, it did get broken. And the way it got broken by the Polish and British was they built a machine called Bomba. And Bomba is a machine to brute force Enigma keys. So here's a Bomba machine. It has a lot of wheels, right? All these circular things. So what is every circular disk? Each circular disk is actually a rotor. So they're basically trying different rotor combinations with this gigantic machine and automating that. So that's what Bomba was doing. And it did so in a smarter way, so they didn't have to try all this many keys. They had ideas to narrow it down to. So what are a lot of things that helped Enigma get broken? So some people pointed out that in Enigma, letters actually could have mapped to themselves, which was a problem, and that limited a lot of the possibilities. So that was an implementation error. But some of the more 161 relevant reasons behind Enigma getting broken were Kirchhoff's principle, right? So the Germans thought, well, they don't even know how Enigma works. So how are they going to even try to break it? They don't know the algorithm. But guess what the Allies did? They just stole a couple of Enigma machines. So they went in the battlefield and they were like, yoink, and they took an Enigma machine. So once you have an Enigma machine, you can take it apart, and now you know what the algorithm is. So you can start attacking that. And you can play with it yourself. So that was a problem. They failed to consider Kirchhoff's principle. They also left themselves open to known plaintext attacks, which we didn't talk about, but the idea is the Germans often send messages that are predictable. So every morning they take the weather report, encrypt it with Enigma, and then send it out. And so we, or the Polish and British, when they received a ciphertext at 8 a.m. in the morning, they knew this is probably a weather report, and they can try decrypting it like that. And then they also left themselves vulnerable to chosen plaintext attacks. So what the Allies did was they could put some soldiers at Normandy, and then they know that the Germans are going to report, hey, I see soldiers at Normandy, and they're going to encrypt that with Enigma. So we can basically trick them into encrypting messages, right? If I put soldiers at a different place, then they're going to say soldiers here, and then I can force them to encrypt that. So we can even force the Germans to do chosen plaintext attacks. So a combination of implementation flaws, Kirchhoff's principle, known plaintext attacks, and chosen plaintext attacks, and a whole lot of different things. It's a really interesting story if you want to go find some documentaries or videos about it. Helped us break Enigma. And I guess one thing that's not mentioned here is, or I guess it is mentioned now, is brute force. So the Germans never considered that we would hire, the Allies would hire like 10,000 people to work on Enigma. So it's a gigantic operation. They had a huge campus with the world's smartest mathematicians and a lot of computers, a lot of technology, and all of it was just focused on breaking Enigma. So they never considered that the Allies would spend so much money to break Enigma, but we did, and that's how Enigma got broken. So what was the legacy of Enigma? So why are we talking about it? Well, it turns out Enigma actually was really influential in computer science. So one of the people who worked on Enigma and breaking it was Alan Turing. And you might have heard of him because he would go on to be one of the founding fathers computer science. And most experts actually agree that the fact that we broke Enigma and we got to read German messages helped shorten the war in Europe by about a year. So yes, cryptography and computer science can save lives. And this is a really classic example of how that happened. And I have some extra space, so here's a colorized photo. So that was the 1940s. Now we're going to skip ahead one last time and talk about the 1970s or so. So after World War II, someone called Claude Shannon started working on information theory, and that's how modern cryptography got started. And in 1976, there was this classic paper called New Directions in Cryptography, which showed how you can use number theory to implement cryptography on computers. So that was a paper, it was really famous. The authors are called Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, and they won a Turing Award in 2015, which is the highest award in computer science, just for writing this paper. And this is going to be the era of cryptography that we're focusing on because it's the modern era, and this is how computers do cryptography today. So down here I have Diffie, I have Hellman. Does anyone know which one is which? Does anyone want to guess? Diffie left? Maybe? I will leave it to you to do the research. So someone said looks like a Diffie. Yeah, maybe, right? I mean, this guy has a luxurious beard, right? You can feel like every little hair on the beard is teeming with knowledge. But is he Diffie or is he Hellman? You'll have to look it up yourself after lecture. So what are some takeaways from all this blue slide nonsense that I just talked about? Well, we talked about the history, right? So it started with paper and pencil. So Caesar and Cipher, you can do it yourself with paper and pencil. Then we talked about Enigma, which was done on a mechanical machine. And then today we're talking about computers. So that's the brief history of cryptography. And hopefully by talking about all this stuff, you gain some intuition on the definitions that we just threw at you earlier. So now you know about chosen plaintext attacks, brute force attacks, keys, encryption, decryption, and so on. So that's the goal of this giant blue slide wall. Okay. So here's a kind of sloppy roadmap. I was going to clean this up, but I guess we ran out of time. But basically, here's a random scattering of topics that we're going to cover. So the important thing here is there's kind of a 2x2 table here. So the way we build this is there are two different models of keys. So we talked about symmetric key and asymmetric key. There are also two different categories of properties that we care about. There's confidentiality and there's integrity and authentication. So if we split up cryptography into these axes, we get this 2x2 diagram. So there are symmetric key schemes that provide confidentiality. There are asymmetric key schemes that provide confidentiality. There are symmetric key schemes that provide integrity and authentication. There are also asymmetric key schemes that provide integrity and authentication. And we're going to spend a lot of time on all of these, but this is the general outline. So for today, we will start on this side. So we're going to talk about symmetric key, and we're just going to talk about schemes that provide confidentiality. So no integrity for now, no authentication. That comes on, I think, Thursday. But for today, confidentiality, symmetric key. So that's called symmetric key encryption because encryption means we're providing confidentiality. Again, no integrity for now, no authentication, just confidentiality. And symmetric key means Alice and Bob share the same secret key that the attacker doesn't know. So for now, don't worry about how this happened. You can just assume that one day the gods of crypto descended from their cloud or wherever they're hanging out, and they blessed Alice and Bob with the secret key that nobody else knows. Now, later in the class, we'll talk about how that happened, but for now, just assume that heavenly music played, there's like a beam of light that came down from the sky, and Alice and Bob now have a secret key. And we'll worry about that later. Now, for modern schemes, we're going to assume that messages are bit strings. So a bit string is a sequence of bits, and a bit is 0 or 1. So here's a bit string. That's a lot of bits concatenated in a string. And the reason why we're going to talk about bit strings is because any data that I want to encrypt can generally be converted into a bit string before encryption. So it's kind of an abstraction. So if I want to encrypt an image or text or video or sound, all of it can be converted into bit strings first, and then I encrypt it. So that's how we'll think about data in bits. Okay, so just as a quick refresher, this is how symmetric key encryption works. So to build a scheme, I have to define 3 different things, and we saw this earlier in the history. So we have to define, how do you create a key? What is the key? Is it a number? Is it a mapping of letters? Is it a rotor position? Is it a blackboard position? We have to define what a key is. Then we have to define how you encrypt a message. So how do you encrypt the plain text to get ciphertext? Then we have to define how you decrypt. And usually decryption is the opposite of encryption. So once we define these three different things, we have a symmetric key encryption scheme. And we saw this earlier as well. And what properties do we want from a symmetric encryption scheme? Well, we want correctness. It should be correct. When I decrypt a ciphertext, I should get the original message. So the decryption of the encryption should come back as the original message. I should have efficiency, so encryption and decryption should be fast. And I should have security, which is confidentiality. Now let's think a little bit more about how you define confidentiality. So far, all we said was an adversary can't read our messages, which is fine, but it's not a very specific definition, right? What if Eve can read the first half of the message, but not the second half? Or what if Eve figures out that the message starts with Dear Bob? It's not clear. Is that still confidential? Is it not confidential? We didn't really talk about that. We also didn't talk about prior knowledge. So what if Eve already knew that the message ends in Sincerely Alice? Or what if Eve knows that the message is either buy or sell, but doesn't know which one? Is that still confidential? I mean, technically the adversary can read it, but they already could before. So is that confidential? It's not clear. So we're going to give you a more formal definition of confidentiality. And what this one says is the ciphertext should not give the attacker any additional information about the plain text. So they might know something now, but seeing the ciphertext is not going to give them any extra information. And that's the formal definition of confidentiality. And to test this, we can come up with an experiment. So here's how this is going to work. Alice has encrypted and sent one of two messages. Either she encrypted M0 or she encrypted M1. And Eve is going to know that either M0 or M1 was sent, but Eve is not going to know which one was sent. Now Eve is going to read the ciphertext, which she knows is either encryption of M0 or encryption of M1, but doesn't know which one. And she's going to try to guess which message was sent. And if the probability that Eve correctly guesses which message is sent is 1/2, then the encryption scheme is confidential. Someone asked, what happens if the ciphertext gives information about the key? That's a really good question. And using this formal definition, also, I guess you're right that it should say any additional information about the plaintext or key, maybe. But basically, the idea is that the ciphertext doesn't give her any additional information that she doesn't know already. Maybe you can say, if the ciphertext gave her information about the key, then she could use that information about the key to also learn about the plaintext. So maybe like that. But for this class, the definition is going to be, we don't give the attacker any additional information about the plaintext. So the way we're going to define this is, if Eve tries to guess which message was sent, and the probability that she's right is 1/2, then the encryption scheme is confidential. So where does the 1/2 come from? Does anyone have ideas? So why does it say 1/2? Why not say 2/3 or 0 or something else? Just guessing, right? So even if she had no information, she could still just toss a coin and guess, and she would be right 1/2 of the time. So what we're saying here is that if E's probability of being correct is greater than 1/2, then that means that she learned something and she's doing better than random. If she's doing better than random, then she learned something about the plaintext and the encryption scheme is not confidential. But if the probability that she's right is always 1/2, then she may as well be guessing. She didn't learn anything new. So she may as well have just not read the ciphertext at all. So that's how the encryption scheme is confidential. So that's our experiment. And I guess I talked about this already, so we'll skip over that. Now remember, there's one last thing we forgot to include here, which is our threat model. Eve can also perform a chosen plain text attack, and we didn't talk about that yet. So Eve can trick Alice into encrypting messages that she chooses. And that's in our threat model. We said that attackers can do this, so we have to account for that. So how are we going to tweak our definition? We're going to adapt our experiment just a little bit, and we're going to say, even if Eve is able to trick Alice into encrypting messages, so even if we give Eve this extra power of chosen plain text attack, the probability that she guesses, still 1/2. So before, our definition was just her probability of guessing after seeing the ciphertext is 1/2. Now our new definition is the probability that she guesses is 1/2, even if we give her an extra power of encrypting messages. And this definition now has a name. It's so important that we give it a name. It's called INCPA, or indistinguishability, which is the IND part, under chosen plaintext attack, CPA. So this is kind of a messy definition. It's a lot of words and it's hard to think about. So instead of thinking about it in words, we're going to think about it in terms of a game that either the adversary can win or lose. And this game will let us define confidentiality precisely. So here's the game. So the game is played between two people. Eve is the adversary, Alice is the challenger. And basically they're playing against each other to see whether the scheme is secure or not. So Alice thinks the scheme is secure. Alice says, I think this scheme is confidential. And Eve says, no, it's not. And now they're going to try to play a game against each other to see whether the scheme is confidential. So Alice bets it's confidential, Eve bets it's not confidential, and we're going to see who wins. So the first step is we're going to give Eve the power to perform a chosen plaintext attack. So Eve can send a message to Alice. Alice will send back the encryption every single time. And she can repeat this as many times as she wants. So she can send 10 messages, and Alice will encrypt all 10 and give it back to Eve. And the reason why this is here is because we gave Eve the power of chosen plaintext attack. Once she's done playing with chosen plaintext attack and she feels ready, Eve is going to give Alice 2 messages, M0 and M1. So Alice receives 2 messages. Now Alice is going to randomly choose one, so flip a coin. If it comes up heads, encrypt M0. If it comes up tails, encrypt M1. And send the encryption back to Eve. And she's not going to tell Eve which one was encrypted. So all Eve sees is that either M0 was encrypted or M1 was encrypted. And she knows that this encryption is one of the two, but she doesn't know which one it is. So this is basically the same as the experiment from before. Now we're going to give Eve another chance to do chosen plaintext attack. So Eve can again choose a plaintext, send it to Alice, and Alice will encrypt it and send it back to Eve. So we give Eve a second chance to keep playing with the algorithm. Then once Eve feels ready, she's going to guess. So she's going to say, Alice, you encrypted M0, or Alice, you encrypted M1. So that's the game. It's basically the same definition as before. We're going to draw it out as a game because I guess games are fun and they help us define confidentiality. So who wins? Well, if Eve correctly guesses, then she wins because she guessed it. She learned the message. If Eve guesses incorrectly, then she didn't learn the message and she loses. Alice wins. And the definition, I guess I'll skip over that for 1 second. But the way to prove that the scheme is insecure is if Eve can win the NCPA game with probability greater than 1/2. So if she can guess with greater than 1/2 probability, then she has learned something about the message and she can win with probability greater than 1/2. And again, 1/2 is the probability of winning by random guessing. So if you're doing better than random guessing, then you learn something about the plaintext. And if you can't win with greater than 1/2 probability, then, and the probability that you win is 1/2, then you're basically guessing. So you didn't learn anything and the scheme is secure. And one kind of really cool thing about NCPA, I think, is what kind of strategy is Eve using? So how is she guessing, right? Is she flipping a coin? Is she looking at the ciphertext and analyzing it? Is she doing frequency analysis? What is she doing, right? What strategy is she using? So the power of NCPA is that we're not assuming that Eve uses any strategy. Eve can use any strategy she wants. She can use an existing strategy. She can invent her own strategy. She can do whatever she wants. She can randomly guess. She can do whatever she wants. And the idea is that if there's one strategy that she can do out there that's better than 1/2 probability of winning, then if Eve can win with probability greater than 1/2, then the scheme is not secure. But if for all strategies, Eve cannot win with greater than 1/2 probability, then the scheme is secure. Now notice it says for all strategies. So what does that mean? That means that this scheme is secure no matter what Eve does. She can do things that we know about. She can even invent her own attack, and the scheme is still secure. So if I've proven with math that my scheme is NCPA secure, even if Eve, comes up with some brand new math, our scheme is still NCPA secure. It's secure against attacks that we don't know about. Well, that's kind of mind-blowing, right? It's like this scheme, not only is it secure, but even if you invent some new thing to break my scheme, it's not going to work. I can guarantee it to you. You do whatever you want. Go invent your own math, go win a Turing Award or a Nobel Prize or whatever, and come back with math. You still can't break it. And that's kind of like, wow, I've never seen that in math before I took this class. So that's why NCPA is really cool, because not only does it defend against attacks we know about, it even defends against brand new attacks. And that's pretty wild. So I'll let that sink in for a moment and ask if anyone has questions. Any questions? Okay, we're almost done.
There's a raised hand. I don't know if you want to.
Oh yeah, go for it. Sorry,
feel free to unmute. Oh, I turned off unmuting, didn't I? Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question if you raise your hand.
Thank you. In the lecture, they mentioned something about a negligible, which is 1 over the number of atoms in the world, something like that. Is there a specific reason they're putting that, or is that's just a cute number they use?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're gonna talk about it like right now. So just anything else? Okay. So I think we talked about this. Okay. So yeah, I think as someone just mentioned, there are 3 kind of wacky edge cases that we have to talk about. So we'll just get this out of the way now. The first edge case is length. So cryptographic schemes are allowed to leak the length of the message. So it's okay if the cryptographic scheme tells us how long the message is. The reason why we allow a crypto scheme to leak the length is because the only way to not leak the length is make all the ciphertext the same length, right? If every ciphertext is the same length, then I have no idea how long the message is. The problem with that is it doesn't really work in the real world. So let's say I made every ciphertext 128 bits long. Now you can't figure out how long my message is because the ciphertext is always 128 bits long. The problem is, what if I have a message that's 129 bits long? Now I can't encrypt it. It doesn't fit in 128 bits. So that doesn't work. I can't encrypt long messages. Well, then you say, let's make every ciphertext 1 gigabyte long. Let's make it 1 billion bytes or however many bytes long. So it's huge. Now I can encrypt long messages. But what if I wanted to send a message like yes or hello or something very short? How much do I have to encrypt? I have to encrypt 1 gigabyte of, I have to create a 1 gigabyte ciphertext and send that. That would be pretty awful, right? If I wanted to just email you 1 word, like hi, or yes, or approved, but I have to send you 1 gigabyte of data over the internet, that would be pretty inefficient. So because both solutions are kind of ugly, we are just going to say it's okay if the scheme leaks the length. It just doesn't work if we don't. So to model this in the NCPA game, we're going to require that M0 and M1 be the same length. So they have to be the same length. And the reason why is because now Eve has to learn something besides message length in order to win the NCPA game. So that's our first edge case. The next edge case is attacker runtime. So sometimes, in theory, there's an attack, but that attack would take so long that nobody is ever going to try it. And we do mean like astronomical numbers. So like if I have an attack and it takes the life of the solar system to complete, it's probably not going to happen, right? The solar system is going to cease to exist by the time I'm done. So that's probably not going to happen. So in the NCPA game, we're going to limit Eve to a practical runtime. So Eve is not allowed to try things like an attack that takes the life of the universe. So she can't do that. And that lets us model real world attacks and not theoretical attacks that will never happen. And one common limit that you might see is we say Eve is limited to polynomial runtime algorithms. So she can't use exponential time algorithms because those blow up and quickly become life of the solar system lengths or sizes. And the last one is the one that someone just asked about, which is negligible advantage. So in some cases, maybe Eve has a strategy to win the game with probability 1/2 plus 1 over 2 to the 128. Well, wait a minute. It's greater than 1/2, technically, by math, but it's so close to 1/2 that it's basically 1/2. Nobody can tell the difference between 1/2 and 1/2 plus 1 over 2 to the 128. That number is like the size of an atom or something. I think it's even smaller than the size of an atom. I don't know. Basically, Eve's advantage is so tiny that it's not useful. So she can win with this probability, but if you ask her to do it in the real world, she'll basically be flipping a coin. Like you can't even tell the difference. It looks like she's flipping a coin. So the advantage is so small and useless that she can't use it for any practical attacks. In the NCPA game, we're going to model this by saying the scheme is secure, even if Eve can win with probability 1/2 plus negligible. So if the probability is like this, the scheme is still secure. If the probability is like 1/2 plus 1 over 1 to the 20, 1 over 2 to the 128, that's negligible. Doesn't matter. It's basically 1/2. But if the probability is like 2/3, then that's non-negligible, and that means Eve is really learning something about the message. So don't worry about the actual mathematical definition of negligible. You don't have to worry about it for this class. But basically, if it's so close to 1/2 that it's like astronomically close, then don't worry about it. If it's something like 2/3, that's a real advantage. Okay. I think we're almost short on time, so I'm probably going to run out of time, but we'll start one-time pads, and I guess we'll have to wrap it up tomorrow. I think tomorrow's lecture is shorter, though, so everything will balance out. Okay, so one-time pads. So this is going to be our very first cryptographic scheme. We talked about how to define confidentiality. Now we're actually going to think about a scheme that might provide confidentiality, and it's called one-time pads. So it's our very first scheme. Before we start, we have to talk a bit about XOR. So if you've taken 61C or some other systems class, you may have seen XOR before. It's an operator that takes 2 bits, outputs 1 bit, and here's the definition of it. There are some useful properties. They're all listed here. The one that I'll point your attention to is the last one, which says X XOR Y, XOR X is equal to Y. So the way you think about this is like I have a value X XOR Y. If I XOR the X, what you can think about is like the X's cancel out. I should be using the laser pointer, but I don't have it right now. So if I take X XOR Y and I XOR it with X, these two X's cancel out and I get the Y back. So think about XOR as being able to cancel itself out. I think it's the easiest way to think about this. And you can prove that by using these properties above, but we don't have time for that, so I will leave you to it. And feel free to ask afterwards if you want to see XOR math. You can also do algebra with XOR. So for example, I say Y XOR 1 equals 0, and I want to solve for Y. I can XOR both sides by 1. So that's what I did here. And then I can simplify. So notice that Y XOR 1 XOR 1, the ones cancel out and I get the Y back. And on the right side, by definition, that's 1. So you can also XOR and do algebra. And when you're doing algebra, you can do things like cancel out the 1. So that will come in handy as well. Okay, so that's our really quick XOR review. Now let's talk about one-time pads. So remember, a crypto scheme takes 3 things, right? We have to learn how do you generate a key, and then how do you encrypt something, and then how do you decrypt something. So let's work on all of those now. So to generate a key, the key is just a randomly chosen bit string. So these are all bits that were randomly chosen. So I just flipped the coin a lot of times and I got this bit string. And recall, we're in the symmetric key setting, so Alice and Bob both know this key. So the crypto gods came down from above and blessed Alice and Bob with this key that nobody else knows. How they shared it, we'll worry about that later. Okay, now here's the plain text M that Alice wants to encrypt. So the idea behind a one-time pad is we're going to use XOR, which we just saw, to scramble up M with the bits of K. So let's scramble it up. So we'll just XOR every single bit 1 by 1. And the ciphertext is just, well, you know, the first bit 0 in the key, 1 in message, and so the ciphertext is 1. And I do this for every single bit, and this is the ciphertext, and that's what I send over to Bob. Now, Bob receives the ciphertext. Bob also knows the key, because remember, the crypto people came down and blessed us with the keys. So how is Bob going to recover M? Any thoughts? There's only one real operation that we've seen, right? XOR again, right? And remember, XOR had that nice property where things cancel out. So we're basically going to take advantage of that and cancel out the key. So this C, the ciphertext, contains the message and the key. If I XOR with the key again, the key will basically cancel itself out and I'll get the message back. So that's the intuition. And again, I do it bit by bit. So you know, the 5th bit of the message is encrypted with the 5th bit of the key, and also decrypted with the 5th bit of the key. So that's one-time pad. Here it is in math. It's basically what we just said. And the only thing on here that's really notable is that for one-time pads, we have to generate a new key for every message. So every message has a new key. That's a little bit different from Enigma or Caesar, but for one-time pads, every key, every message uses a different key. Okay. So remember, there are 3 different properties, right? We want correctness, efficiency, and security. So let's try to prove all of those now. So first, we have to make sure it's correct. If I encrypt and then I decrypt, I had better always get the original message back. Not sometimes, not occasionally, it should always be true, no matter what the key is, no matter what the message is. So let's try to prove that. here's the definition of encryption. I take the key, I XOR it with the message. That's just what we talked about before. Now, I'm going to try to decrypt the encryption. And this should give me the original message back, right? If I encrypt, then I decrypt, I should get the original thing back. So let's try and do that. Well, the definition of encryption, as we set up here, is K XOR M. So I'm just going to plug that in here, right? I took the encryption, I replaced it with K XOR M. Now, the definition of decryption is also just C XOR M. Take the ciphertext XOR with the key, sorry, C XOR K. So by definition, the decryption function is just K XOR whatever I'm trying to decrypt. And in this case, I'm trying to decrypt this. And by the XOR property that things cancel out, these two Ks cancel out, and I get the M back. So I proved with math that one-time pads are always correct. If I encrypt, then I decrypt with the same key, I will get the message back. So that's correctness. Now let's talk about security. So we're going to use the definition from before. We say the ciphertext doesn't give you any additional information about the plain text. So the definition or the experiment was basically, she has encrypted one of the two messages. I don't know which one was encrypted. I will read the ciphertext and try to guess. And if I don't learn any extra information and my guessing probability is 1/2, then the scheme is confidential. So we're going to use this experiment to show that one-time pads are secure. So here we go. There are two different possibilities, right? The first possibility is Alice sent and encrypted M0. Second possibility is she encrypted M1. So what do these two possibilities look like? In the first possibility, the ciphertext is K XOR M0 by definition, right? This is the encryption algorithm. Now, if I do a little bit of XOR math, and you can try this yourself, the key is equal to C XOR M0. So I basically XOR both sides and did some canceling, and I got the key is equal to C XOR M0. Okay, now let's try the second possibility. In this case, the ciphertext is C equals K XOR M1. So I encrypted M1. In this case, K is equal to C XOR M1 by doing the same XOR math. Now, the thing to notice here is that which possibility am I in? If I'm Eve and I know that it's one of these two possibilities, but I don't know which one it is, can I even figure out which one it really was? Well, I don't know the key, but I do know that the key was chosen randomly. If the key was chosen randomly, this could be the key, and this could be the key. Both of them are equally possible. It's random, right? There's no way for me to figure out that one of these two keys was more likely than the other because I don't know the key. So because the key was random and because as Eve, I don't know the key, both of these are equally possible. I didn't learn any extra information. I learned that it was one of these two, but I have no idea which one it is. So as Eve, I didn't learn any extra information. Both of these are equally possible. The best I can do as Eve is I can just flip a coin and tell you 0 or 1. Is it this one? Is it this one? Which key is it? I don't know. So I'll just guess with probability 1/2. And that means this scheme is perfectly secure. So no information leakage whatsoever. Even if you had infinite algorithms, you still couldn't break it. So one-time pads, perfectly secure, great. Now, remember, one of the caveats was that we had to not reuse the key. What happens if I do reuse the key? Well, let's find out. I have two different messages. I encrypt them with the same key this time. So I use the same key twice, and I put them through encryption. So Eve is going to see K XOR M0 and K XOR M1. So Eve sees two ciphertexts encrypted with the same key. Does anyone have an idea what Eve might try to do at this stage? Is it still secure? Can Eve do something more clever? In the interest of time, I'll just skip it over and say, whoa, what if she does this? So she takes the two messages and XORs them together. So you get K XOR M0, XOR K XOR M1. If I cancel out the Ks using the cancel out property, I get M0 XOR M1. Wait a minute, that's something about the messages. I learned the XOR of the two messages. That's something I learned. It's information leakage. So two-time pad is not secure because I can leak information. I learned that M0 XOR M1 is this. So if I have a guess for M1, I will also learn what M0 is. Or if I have a guess for M0, I'll learn what M1 is. So, whoa, I just learned something about the messages. So here it is in words. The K's cancel out, I get M0 XOR M1. That's partial information about the messages. So it's no longer secure if I reuse the key. I think we talked about this. So again, one-time pads, if I never use the key, perfect security. Eve has no idea what I sent. She can't even begin to guess. If I reuse the key, Eve can learn about my messages, so it's not secure. So one-time pads, yes. Two-time pads, no. Okay, so that's the takeaway. So you have to use a different key for every message. So that's one-time pads. It's great, but I have to generate a new key, which is kind of not practical. So why is it not practical? How much time do I have left? I have 10 minutes. Hey, maybe I'll make it. Okay, so sorry. I had to exit full screen to check the time. But now we'll go back and I'll turn on the laser pointer and then I will make it full screen. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so one-time pads are not practical for a couple of reasons. The first reason is key generation, right? For security to hold, I have to generate a new key for every message, and I can never reuse the same key twice. Because if I do, Eve will do the thing that we just saw and break our security. So I have to generate a new key, and as we'll see later, generating random keys is kind of expensive. So I don't want to have to do that for every single message. The second problem is key distribution. So to communicate a message that's n bits long, I have to securely communicate an n-bit key. So I know we kind of said earlier that we can just assume the crypto gods have done this for us, but let's think about what happened if they didn't do this for us. So Alice and Bob, before they can communicate their n-bit message, they first have to securely communicate an n-bit key. Why does that feel kind of weird? Does anyone have thoughts on why that's kind of impractical? If I've already securely communicated an n-bit key, why not just send the message, right? I securely communicated n bits to you to use as the key, then why not just communicate the message, right? Like, why did I even bother to send you the key first? So one-time pads, basically useless in the real world. One maybe practical application is if you communicate the keys in advance. So Alice and Bob meet in person. They have a secure channel now, but they don't have the secure channel later. So maybe now they communicate the keys now while they have the secure channel, and then they go home. And then when they don't have the secure channel anymore, they use the keys as a one-time pad. That's maybe the only practical application is if you have a channel now and then later you don't. But besides that, one-time pads basically are not that useful. And this kind of practical application is really not seen a lot in the real world. It's very rare that you have a channel now, but you don't have it later. Maybe the only time you ever have this kind of thing is if you're a spy. So if you're old school Cold War era spy, what you do is you're at home base, so you're in your home country, you obtain a book of keys. So you have a lot of keys because right now you're in your home country and you have a secure way to get the keys. So you're in the office of your little security base and you get your keys. And then you're ready to go spy. So I will now go to the enemy country, I'll go spy, I'll learn some information. When I learn some information, I will encrypt the secret message with a one-time pad that I obtained earlier, and I'll broadcast that back to home base. So maybe the only way that one-time pads are super useful is if you're a spy. And I think there's some radio station stuff that we'll skip, but you can read about this yourself. And this actually happened in the real world. So in, I think, World War II, Soviet spies, so spies from the Soviet Union, were using one-time pads to communicate. So they had spies in the United States, and they wanted to send information back to the Soviet Union, so they used one-time pads. The problem is, for some reason during World War II, they started reusing keys. Is that safe? Not really, right? I don't know why they did it, but they started reusing keys. And so the US created a project called Venona, which was designed to break the messages. So if you can learn the XOR of the two messages, you can try to decrypt the messages and learn about them. So that's what we did. And this allowed us to confirm spies. And it actually went on until 1980. And even in 1980, it was top secret. Nobody knew about this until 1995. Even in the 1940s, President Truman did not know that this was going on. So it was extremely top secret, but apparently the US used it to gain some information. So this is basically the one time you will ever see one-time pads being used, is if you're a spy. If you're not a spy, then you're probably not using one-time pads. Okay. I think we'll save traffic analysis for tomorrow because it's really short. And it looks like by some miracle, I actually made it in time. Does anyone have any last minute questions? Yeah, I know today was kind of a lot. Hopefully the history of crypto was like a bit lighter so you could take a mental break, but I don't know. Okay, if no last questions, I just remembered that I do have to show you the summary, so let me do that. Okay, so we'll skip over the traffic analysis, and we'll do this tomorrow, so don't worry about it. But here's the summary. Basically, today we talked about what's crypto. Crypto is communicating securely over insecure channels. Now, remember the disclaimer, and we'll remind you over and over about it, so don't worry if you didn't hear it the first 10 times. Do not write your own crypto. Use existing libraries instead. Because if you write your own crypto, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And if they can go wrong, they will go wrong. And your own crypto will break. And you will become a slide in our future lectures. So don't do that. There are a whole bunch of definitions we threw at you about how we define crypto problems and how we define a good solution or a bad solution. So Alice and Bob want to send messages over an insecure channel. Those are our heroes. Eve is the villain who wants to read messages. Mallory is the villain who wants to modify messages. We want confidentiality, which says you can't read. Integrity says you can't tamper with a message without being detected. Authenticity says you can prove that the message came from the sender. Crypto uses keys. Those are our basic building block. Kirchhoff's principle says the attacker knows everything but the key. There are a lot of different threat models that we use. In this class, we'll focus on chosen plain text, which means Eve can trick Alice into encrypting some messages. So that's our threat model. Then we talked about NCPA security, which is our first definition for measuring security. And then the definition said, even if we give Eve the power of chosen plaintext attack, we will let her trick Alice into encrypting messages of her choice. Given the encryption of M0 or M1, she cannot distinguish which message was sent with probability greater than 1/2. So she's reduced to guessing because the ciphertext didn't give her any extra information. So she just has to guess. And we can use the NCPA game, which is basically a game version of this, to test for NCPA security, depending on who wins and with what probability that they win. And finally, there are 3 edge cases. So if NCPA leaks length, that's still secure. Eve is limited to polynomials and algorithms, and her advantage must be not negligible. So it can't be like 1/2 plus 1/2 to the 128 or whatever in order to win. And finally, we talked about one-time pads, which is our very first cryptographic scheme. And the way it worked is Alice and Bob share a secret key because of symmetric encryption. To encrypt, you XOR with the key. To decrypt, you XOR with the key again, and they cancel out because of XORs. If you do not reuse the key, it does not leak information because Eve sees one of those 2 possibilities and doesn't know which one it is. If you do reuse the keys, it leaks all sorts of information, so it's not useful. And because you have to send a huge amount of keys, it's really not that practical unless you're a spy for whatever reason, in which case, please don't spy on me, thank you. So that's today. We saw one-time pads, great in theory, not good in practice. So tomorrow's lecture is going to be how do we create practical symmetric encryption schemes? So how do we create schemes that actually do work in the real world? And we're still thinking about symmetric encryption tomorrow. Okay, now I made it almost exactly in time. Are there any final questions? I saw a lot of talk, but I think Nicholas may have handled it because some of them were pretty lengthy. But if there are no other questions for now, I'll just stop the recording.
There's some chat about quantum algorithms going on in the chat. If you want to stay around afterwards, then we can talk about it for like 30 seconds.
Sure. Am I talking about it, or because I don't know?
Well, I don't know that much about it. I'm actually going to take a course on quantum next semester, but you should